In June, Imre and I decided to make a road trip through Romania. If you followed our story to this point, you will recall that Imre's mother, Lily, was born and raised in Cluj, and that she and her mother were hidden during the war by Imre's father, Robert, a Frenchman who had himself escaped from a German camp for captured soldiers. In fact, Robert ended up helping a number of Romanian Jews escape. Some people have suggested he should be designated among the righteous of the nations, but being a self-effacing man, neither he nor his family had any interest in that. Still, a couple of years ago, Imre's second cousin, Julika, arranged a ceremony in Cluj memorializing Robert's actions, and Julika prepared a documentary film for the occasion. She works as a broadcaster for the Romanian public television network. That may make her sound like a media bigwig, and in fact she is, but the resources for this kind of thing in Romania are quite limited. Julika once traveled to the United States to visit some other distant relatives living in the Orthodox community in Queens, and she was introduced to some media professionals there who asked her how much a television presenter earned in Romania. She answered that she made the equivalent of about $100. They said, "Per hour?" She said, "No, per month." Still, she's had the opportunity to work with some very interesting people who have passed through Cluj, particularly those who have any connection to the Jewish community. You can find on YouTube an interview she did with Elie Wiesel. When I say Jewish community, I should add what Julika told me about what that means. Before the war, there were about 16,000 Jews in Cluj. 2,000 survived. Most of them left, many for Israel, some for the United States. Today there are about 400 Jews in Cluj. While she has a very strong sense of ethnic heritage, Julika isn't herself a particularly religious person. She's married to a lovely, unassuming Gentile named Adi, a scientist who told me with a faint smile over dinner, "I don't care about religion. I am atheist." I said, "Me too." Julika and Adi have been married for about 40 years. They have one son, also quiet, who did his doctorate in ethnomusicology. Imre had been on a pilgrimage to Cluj with his mother in the 90s. He went back for that memorial ceremony as well, but by that time Lily was too frail to make the trip with him. In fact, she passed just 1 week after. Although I only met Lily twice, I adored her, and I loved the idea of seeing where she was from. When Imre told Julika of our plans, he asked her to try to get us a gig, and indeed she scored one without much difficulty at the Transylvanian Ethnographic Museum. In our 3 years of touring, this was the first gig Imre had initiated, and he seemed a little proud of himself. When I looked the museum up online, the only performance videos I could find were of a Transylvanian Armenian ethnic dance company. We wondered for a minute if we'd need some sort of special ethnic costumes, like a beret for Imre and a Met's cap for me, but then we figured we pretty much always wore our native dress, so we didn't need to make any special accommodations on that count. As for the rest of the trip, I pored over Google Maps, rummaged around the Airbnb site, and made some suggestions. Imre reconciled my internet findings with his more intuitive ideas before we settled on a route. We'd land in Cluj, play our gig, and then pick up a rental car and head for the Carpathian Mountains, the site of Bram Stoker's Dracula, then Bucharest, and then Constanța on the coast of the Black Sea. On our way back, we'd pass through Sinaia, a mountain resort, and then hop back to Cluj to get our flight home. By home, I mean Imre's home in Normandy. I went there to stay with him at the very end of May. We spent a couple of days there preparing for the trip, reading up a bit and watching some films. Of course, that whole Dracula story was the product of Bram Stoker's lively imagination, but it seems there was indeed a fairly bloody prince known as Vlad the Impaler, who didn't hesitate to, surprise, impale his enemies, the Turkish invaders. For this reason, he is still considered a figure of resistance. It was only a little disconcerting to note how strongly Vlad the Impaler and Imre resembled one another. But, to be fair, there was another legendary figure from the region who was arguably even more gruesome, Elizabeth Bathory, who was reputed to maintain her youthful complexion by bathing daily in the blood of virgins. Oh, speaking of maintaining a youthful complexion, Imre's mother had been an ardent fan of a Romanian face cream called Gero Vital, which Wikipedia will tell you is a controversial preparation developed in Romania during the 1950s and promoted by its advocates as an effective anti-aging treatment. It's been banned by the FDA since 1982 as an unapproved drug. The formula was developed by a woman scientist named Ana Aslan, but rumor has it that her research was funded by the brutally repressive head of state, Nicolae Ceausescu, at the urging of Ceausescu's wife, Elena. Various international studies have cast doubt on both the effectiveness and safety of the product, but none of these nefarious stories seem to have dimmed Imre's enthusiasm for the idea of this cream on account of Lily's fervent recommendation of it. She had Julika send her some by mail on a regular basis, and indeed, when I'd met Lily, I was struck by her radiance at the ripe old age of 96. Imre and I agreed we'd pick some up on our way home. We left France on June 7th. We were flying out of the rinky-dink Beauvais airport, which is a hub for a number of Eastern European airlines. Ours was called Wizz Air, headquartered in Budapest. We had to pay extra for a cup of water. Well, I paid for water. Imre sprang for a warm beer. Julika and Adi met us at the airport and drove us to a little downtown apartment that belonged to a Jewish cultural organization. The place was on a little courtyard off the Strada Tipografiei. It was just our style, small, a little cluttered, strewn with mismatched rugs and pillows, and amply stocked with books we couldn't read. There were no religious icons or even texts, as far as we could tell, unless you count Karl Marx's Kapital. On our first evening, we found a charming outdoor restaurant on a quiet street nearby. Cluj is a small but cosmopolitan city, and both its architecture and its inhabitants exude a kind of relaxed elegance. Imre had told me I'd like it, and indeed, as we sat there sipping our wine, we began to fantasize about having a pied-à-terre there. The next day, we showed up at the museum a couple of hours in advance of our show. We took a stroll through the exhibits and did a quick sound check. There were lots of chairs set up. We had no idea who might show up. Julika had done her best to get the word out. In fact, we were featured in the local paper, and she'd also arranged for a professional videographer to film the gig. Shortly before the show, she conducted brief interviews with both of us, mine in English, Imre's in French. A few minutes before 7, our crowd began to assemble, a mix of young, arty types and some older intellectuals, friends of Julika and Adi, a couple of dozen all told. Musically, things went without a hitch. The audience was very appreciative, sometimes closing their eyes to concentrate on the lyrics, sometimes smiling wistfully during a tender waltz. After we'd wrapped things up, Julika and Adi took us to a restaurant with animal heads on the walls and traditional cuisine. We were served homemade liqueur on the house. When we bid each other goodbye that night, I think it was with genuine affection all around. Later, Julika would write Imre, saying she'd felt the presence of Lily and our own father, Amie, hovering over us. The next morning, we packed up and headed for the town of Magura in the Carpathian Mountains. I realize that if I say, "You've got to go there," it's highly unlikely that you'll follow my advice. It's a 6-hour drive through sometimes treacherous roads from Cluj, but it's absolutely breathtaking. We'd booked a room at an inn on the edge of a mountain forest, and when we stepped out of the car and looked around, it seemed like we'd landed in heaven. Looking down, you saw vast fields of wild flowers and a few grazing sheep. Looking up, you saw astonishingly verdant, pine-covered mountains. The air seemed super-oxygenated. The owner of the inn, Georgi, greeted us with warm woolen socks, and we padded up to our room, which looked out over the little drive and beyond toward a deep valley and then a soaring mountain ridge. Imre stepped out on the balcony to admire the view. I quickly took a peek at my phone and saw an alert regarding a Facebook post in which I'd been tagged. I swiped open the link, and despite the good intentions of the poster, I found the tag alarming, so I spent a minute or two removing it. I stepped out on the balcony to join Imre, where I summarized the disconcerting tag event, which we agreed should immediately be forgotten. After arranging our things, we padded down to the dining room, where we ate delicious home cooking, and then went back to our room and plopped on the bed. We canoodled a little. I said, "Do you want to brush your teeth?" That's kind of a code for what happens after. He smiled and said yes. But relaxed as we were, we began chatting a bit about our current writing project. Imre asked me something about the order of chapters, and I said, "Do you want me to show you the outline?" He hesitated and said, "Okay." Famous last word. I got out my computer and opened the file of my outline, and we looked it over. It looked okay. I said, "Do you want me to send it to you?" He hesitated again and said, "Okay." Well, on opening my email, I couldn't help noticing a message with a heading that indicated some urgency. I looked sideways at Imre. I said, "Uh-oh, I just have to see what this is about." He sprung out of bed with a kind of grin that one might interpret as jovial, or one might suspect served to mask something bordering on outrage. "Okay, if you need to do some email, I'll just take a little walk in the mountains. You can message me when you're done." That's what I heard him say, though later he'd insist that he didn't make that suggestion of texting. I should explain that the urgent email was coming from a dear friend who was concerned about an indiscreet bit of information regarding him that had appeared in an online article about me. He asked if I could intervene in order to stem the flow of gossip. Naturally, I was mortified that I might have inadvertently participated in complicating my friend's life and wanted to nip things in the bud, if that were at all possible. There was a 7-hour time difference between Romania and New York, meaning, despite the fact that it was midnight in the Carpathian Mountains, there might still be time to stop the presses before things got out of control. I said, "This will just take a couple of minutes." In fact, that was true. I managed to reach the source of the indiscretion right away. He apologized and said he'd amend things immediately. But in the 3 minutes or so that took, Imre had disappeared into the Carpathian night. I texted him, "Done." No answer. I went down to the drive and called out, "Imre? Imre?" Nothing. The sky was black. You could barely see a foot in front of your eyes. I lit the flashlight on my phone and pointed it out. I stumbled a bit in the dark and made my way to a path leading up the ridge a bit. My movement evidently drew the attention of a neighboring dog who started to howl. Down the ridge on the other side, I heard a number of dogs howling, probably on account of Imre's own movement. I wondered if I would know the difference between the howling of a dog and that of a wolf. I stumbled back to our room. I texted again, "I went looking for you after 5 minutes, but you were nowhere to be found." No answer. I texted, "I am afraid and sad." Nothing. I said, "Why do you not answer?" Nothing. And as a last stab, "I am in despair. Why do you want me to be afraid?" Evidently, his phone was turned off. I realized that in recounting my reaction, I look ridiculous. But hello, there are wolves in the Carpathian Mountains. Finally, I went back out with my pitiful iPhone flashlight and crunched my way down the path when I heard a little crunching coming back in my direction. Finally, he appeared with that same ambiguous smile he'd had when he left. "Bébé," he said, "what are you doing out here? I was just taking a walk in the mountains." After we got back to our room, I needled him a little, and he finally admitted to being somewhat pissed off by my urge to get on email at midnight in the Carpathian Mountains. The internet, he said, seemed to exert a vampiric control over me. Well, I'm not sorry I nipped in the bud the spread of gossip involving my friend, but I have to confess that, indeed, the online nether realm does sometimes strike me as particularly bleak and scary, and I'm often disconcerted by my own compulsion to return to it. Facebook, in particular, increasingly appears to me as a dominion of profligate bloodsucking. Perhaps some of you know what I'm talking about. So, it took us a little while to get past this tiff, but once I acknowledged the general nefariousness of continuous intravenous electronic access to one's psyche, we came to some kind of truce. The next day we hiked through an astonishing gorge and then up a leafy mountain pass covered in wildflowers. The only sounds were occasional bells clanging from the necks of sheep. At night we slept like angels. On our third day, we made the trip to Brown Castle, ostensibly the ruin on which Stoker based his weird novel. As you can perhaps imagine, it's become quite the tourist trap. Ulika had told us that Ceausescu had also been involved in promoting not only Gera Vital, but also Stoker's suspect horror story. It wasn't clear to me whether Ceausescu's motivation had been attracting tourists, or if he just wanted to attach himself to a figure of unearthly power, the way Papa Doc reportedly used zombie legends to intimidate the Haitian people. Anyway, we took some ghoulish photos at the castle, but we were happy to get back to our mountain love nest for the night. The next day we were back on the road. Bucharest was a little hot and congested, but we managed to find a charming restaurant where we were serenaded by gypsy musicians. Next we headed for Constanța on the Black Sea. The town was founded in 600 BC by the Queen of the Goths, but was captured by the Romans in 29 BC. Jason supposedly landed there with the Argonauts after they picked up the Golden Fleece. Ovid was exiled there, and there's a big square named after him. To tell the truth, we only figured out all this historical business once we got there. We'd mostly been thinking about hitting the beach, which was, indeed, a nice one. We happened upon a group of little Nadia Comaneci clones practicing their handstands and splits. There was a weird episode in which I thought maybe I'd get a manicure, as my nails were starting to look a little ratty, but when I walked into the local beauty salon, nobody would even look at me. It seemed all the nail stations were taken up by what appeared to be working girls, all having terrifying Nosferatu-like claws applied with some sort of acrylic goop. I stood there for a minute in a stupor before deciding to forego the beauty treatment. Later we wandered around the archaeological displays near Ovid Square, and we were very moved by the translations of the ancient Roman tombstones. "Salutation, passerby," they called out. And then the dead person told you a little about him or herself. When I suggested Imre write a song about that, he told me he'd been thinking exactly the same thing. On our route back to Cluj, as I said, we'd decided to stop in Sinaia, which was named, weirdly, after Mount Sinai. It was a little off the main roadway, so as Imre drove, I was navigating with the GPS app that Adi had helped us install on my iPhone. It was called Here We Go, which sounded innocent enough. Maybe you all know about that, or other, even more obvious ways of getting directions on the road, but for us it was news. The app in question was convenient, all right, but also irksome. It regularly made an irritating ping, ping, ping sound if we went slightly past the speed limit, and its directions were delivered in the singularly irritating voice of a British male robot. Plus, it made my phone get really hot. So hot I thought it might burn my hands. Fortunately, we made it to the rambling mountain shack we'd rented before we realized just how toxic that app actually was. It had completely drained the life from my phone's battery. There was no way whatsoever to recharge it. I spent a couple of hours in mild torture, but once I'd calmed down a little, I started to feel quite disencumbered and light. Something uncannily similar happens to Mina in Dracula when the evil count begins to loosen his grasp on her. The wraith-like grip is only truly broken, of course, when they drive a stake through his rancid heart. During our trip, I was reading Stoker's novel, and I'd been tucking little wildflowers between the pages, pressing them so I could slip them into the letters I was writing, by hand, to my best friend. We'd recently decided to correspond this way during a separation which would last most of the summer. I'd sent her a couple of letters from Normandy just before we left, also with a few flowers tucked in. It was particularly fitting, in fact, that we'd gone back to an old-fashioned handwritten correspondence during my reading of Dracula, because Stoker's is among the most famous of epistolary novels. Well, epistolary is actually a reductive way of putting it. Some of it is made up of the personal letters of the characters in the book, notably Lucy and Mina, who engage in chatty, girlish missives that bear a slightly embarrassing resemblance to my own correspondence with my friend, until they both get bitten in the jugular by the Count. But the book also includes some other documents recorded in the most up-to-date technologies of the period: stenographic shorthand and phonographic recordings on wax cylinders, later transcribed by Mina on a typewriter. In fact, she makes special reference to her addiction to a travel typewriter with the same kind of zeal some people express for the iPhone 7. Of course, eventually, after we got back home, I got my own phone back up and running. In fact, the battery hadn't really been destroyed. Once I left it plugged in all night, it came back to life. I think maybe I just needed to believe that Adi's deathly battery-sucking app had finished it off. I realize that's a pretty lame deflection of my own accountability. After all, none of us has to feed the beast, do we?